Hello, welcome one and all to the 8th episode of Dyllon Explains Everything. My name's Dylan, and in case you couldn't tell by the title, I'm the one explaining everything, including the topic of today, Euler. I'm going to be running through a lot of facts, so if you're curious as to where I get my information, check the description below for a list of links. Leonhard Euler was a Swiss pure mathematician who worked at an academy as a scholar and was born in 1707. He discovered many things in geometry, calculus, and trigonometry until he died in 1783. He was born in a town called Basel in Switzerland, and he had an amazing aptitude for mathematics. He also had an amazing memory, which allowed him to meet another Swiss mathematician, Johann Bernoulli. Johann Bernoulli was studying calculus, a fairly new subject at the time, and was mentoring Euler in mathematics. This allowed Euler to go to the University of Basel when he was just 13. 3 years later, when he was 16, Euler got his master's in philosophy, and he had a thesis statement written about Isaac Newton and this guy whose name I'm probably going to butcher. Johann Bernoulli was studying calculus, a fairly new subject at the time, and was able to mentor Euler in mathematics. This allowed Euler to go to the University of Basel at the age of 13. 3 years later, when he turned 16, he became a master of philosophy and wrote his thesis statement on these two scientists. Leonhard's dad, Paul Euler, was a Calvinist pastor and wanted Leonhard to follow in his footsteps. The problem was, Leonhard was clearly gifted in mathematics. Johann and Paul were very good friends, so Johann was able to convince Paul to let Euler study mathematics. This allowed Euler to study with Bernoulli for 3 more years, and even though he didn't follow in his dad's footsteps of being a religious pastor, he still stayed religious most of his life. And after those 3 years were up, he tried to become a professor at the University of Basel, which failed. Then Euler moved to St. Petersburg, where he became a medical lieutenant in the Russian Navy for 3 years. While he was doing that, he lived with Daniel Bernoulli, Johann's son, who was friends with Euler. Then, in 1730, Euler became a professor at the St. Petersburg Academy of Science. Then, in 1733, Daniel Bernoulli left to go back to Basel, where he used to live. At the time, he had the senior chair of mathematics at the St. Petersburg Academy, but since he left, Euler got it. And eventually, Euler also became the head of geography, because, math and geography have so much in common. Then, in 1734, Euler married a girl named Katharina, and they had 13 children during their marriage, which ended in 1773 when Katharina died, though only 5 of their children actually outlived Euler. Eventually, in the late 30s, Euler started using his geography skills to make maps of Russia. This caused him to have severe eye problems, and in 1740 he lost his right eye while working on a map of Russia. And then just a year later, he got an invitation to the Berlin Academy. Euler worked in Berlin for about 25 years and wrote around 380 mathematics articles. In the mid-40s, he became the math director at the Berlin Academy of Science and Beaux Arts, and in 1759 became the leader of the Berlin Academy after its previous leader died. The problem is, the king at the time, Frederick the Great, was in charge of appointing a leader for the academy. But he and Euler weren't on very good terms, so Frederick the Great ignored Euler. Instead, the king wanted to appoint a French mathematician named Jean d'Alembert. The problem is, Jean and Euler had a lot of disagreements in math, and Euler did not like Jean one bit. But Jean turned down the offer, instead going to another academy. This all still annoyed Euler a lot. The king was interfering too much with the academy, so Euler threatened to leave to St. Petersburg again, which he did in 1766, which annoyed the king a lot. Shortly after the move, Euler became completely blind from an illness, and then in 1771 his entire house got burnt down, and the only thing he could save were his mathematical manuscripts. Later in 1771, Euler had a surgery done on his eyes to restore his eyesight. This surgery worked, and he did have his eyesight restored until a few days later when he lost it due to not taking proper care of himself. He still did math, though. He had help, though. Johann and Christoph Euler, his sons, helped him, Johann being the chair of physics at the St. Petersburg Academy of Science, and Christoph being in the military. Another person that helped him was W.L. Kraft, who was a member of the academy, as was A.J. Lexel, another helper. His final helper was N. Fuss, his grandson-in-law, who became his assistant in 1776. Then, later in 1776, Euler remarried his dead wife's half-sister in order to become less dependent on his children, and in September 18, 1783, Euler had a stroke while playing with his grandkids and died. Still, for the next 5 decades, unpublished works by Euler were shown to members of the Academy and to the world as a whole in order to study and make reports on. As mentioned before, Euler was a pure mathematician, which is kind of like the opposite of an applied mathematician. He didn't do things to solve real-world problems. Instead, he studied things like mentioned before, geometry, trigonometry, and calculus, as well as number theory and many, many other things. He made a lot of the stuff that we take for granted in math today, including the f of x notation for the function of x. Another thing Euler studied and picked out the symbol for was pi, or the ratio between a circle's circumference and its diameter. Pi is also known as 3.1459265358979223846267950228499716929375105820. He also studied I, which is the square root of -1, and gave it its value. He also studied calculus and made summation, and he also chose the symbol for it. Summation is basically you take whatever number is on the bottom, put it in for the variable in the equation, and then add that to the total. You do this for all the numbers. 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, so on and so forth, up until you get to the top number, add them all together, and that's your total. He also disproved Fermat's conjecture, which was that 2 to the power of any power of 2 plus 1 would result in a prime. This was correct for 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16, but not for 32, which Euler found out. He also came up with the number E. Imagine that you have $1 in the bank, and the bank is willing to give you 100% interest after a year. Now, you take that deal, and after a year, you have $2. But the bank also offers another option. You can take that deal, or you can take a deal that gives you 50% interest every 6 months, or basically twice in a year. Now, at first, these might seem like they're the same, but they're not. If we work this one out, we would get $1.50 after 6 months, and then after another 6 months, end up with $2.25, rather than the $2 from before. You can continue this pattern for 33.3 repeating percent interest over the course of 3 times a year, or 25% interest over the course of 4 times a year. Eventually, you'll get to an infinitely small percent interest for an infinite amount of times per year, which would get you E, or 2.718281828459045. We can calculate this, though, with the equation 1 plus 1 over n to the power of n as n gets closer to infinity. Basically, the bigger n gets, the closer we get to E, which is exactly what we were showing up here. Another way we can show E is through factorials. Now, if you don't remember factorials from the combinatorics episode, factorials is basically taking whatever number you have and multiplying it by all the previous numbers going back to 1. Euler expressed this as the sum of 1 over n factorial for every number between 1 and infinity. Basically, 1 over 1 factorial plus 1 over 2 factorial plus 1 over 3 factorial, so on and so forth. And this works out really nicely and really accurately, because unlike pi, which is defined by a geometric property, E is defined by an equation and a problem. Speaking of E and pi, did you know that E to the power of I times pi gives you -1? Despite the fact that E and pi both go on forever, and I is technically an imaginary number, as the square root of -1 is impossible. This is because Euler proved that E to the power of I times x gives you cosine x plus I times sine x. This has to do with imaginary numbers, which I could do a whole episode on, but the important thing is that I times sine pi, well, sine pi is just 0, so that cancels out, and cosine pi is equal to -1. Suffice to say, Euler really liked math and was very good at it. He shaped the way we know calculus and helped us a lot with algebra and geometry, as well as many of the numbers that we know to this day, and he heavily influenced the mathematical community. Now, whether you think this is all boring or whether you think this is really interesting, you have to admit Euler did help us in many of the concepts we know about math to this day, and he heavily influenced everything we know about geometry, trigonometry, calculus, algebra, just to name a few. With all that being said, if you enjoyed the video you saw today, why not click subscribe to see more like this, and click the like button to let me know you enjoyed it. If you think one of your friends would like Dyllon Explains Everything, please introduce the channel to them. It really helps me out. And if you have an idea for Dyllon Explains Everything, leave it in the comment section below, and I'll be sure to check it out. And with all that being said, my name's Dylan, and I explain everything.